Welcome to IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Don.
Coming at you live from San Francisco, California.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
Hello, and thank you for watching IT Pro TV, helping you to level up with IT learning everywhere you go. I'm your host, Zach Memis, for this episode of CompTIA Linux Plus. This episode, Installing Ubuntu. And once again, we've asked our expert, Don Pizzette, to show us more. Don, good to see you.
Hey, glad to be back.
Thanks for being here.
You know, like you described, we're going to be taking a look at the Ubuntu operating system. We're going to learn a little bit about what it is, how to get it installed, and some of the basic steps we need to do to make sure that it's all set up and ready to use. It's one of the most popular distributions of Linux, so this is an exercise that a lot of you are going to go through on a regular basis. That's all coming up right here in this episode.
Well, can you give us a little background on Ubuntu?
Absolutely. So, you know, I mentioned it's one of the most popular Linux distributions that's out there, and that's for a few different reasons. It's not particularly original. It's actually based off of the Debian project. So they took Debian and they forked that to create the Ubuntu distro that we use today. Well, what they did is they focused on creating a user experience that was very convenient, easy. You know, it's kind of like Apple with the, it just works type mentality. So when you install it, you won't see as many options as you see when you install something like CentOS or Fedora, and you'll end up with a desktop that's fully configured and ready to go for most users. So that creates a real low barrier to entry for most people. If this is your first time running Linux, Ubuntu is a great operating system to start with because it's designed to be a little easier to use. Now, let me show you their website here. Ubuntu is actually the name of the Linux distro, and it's made by a company called Canonical. And Canonical is actually a for-profit company. Linux is free, right? But what they do is they make money by charging for support. If you need help, you can call them, and they have technicians that can help you with an issue, but it costs money. That's how they stay in business. But if you want to run the operating system, that is absolutely free. Just go to their website and download it. So you'll see those terms, though. Ubuntu, which is the distribution, and then Canonical, which is the actual company. And so you can read about what they do, and you can even buy their services right there for desktop as well as server solutions. It's all there. And I mentioned that it's all based on Debian. You can see the Debian project over at debian.org, debian.org. It is a very, it's an older distribution. And what I mean by older is not like it's out of date. I mean that it's been around a long time. It's very mature, very well established. And for a lot of people to do development, Debian is actually their platform of choice. Well, in the Debian world, they create a number of different environments, and they test a lot of packages, and they get them ready before releasing an actual Debian distro. And before that happens, the people over at Canonical, they take the testing branch of Debian, and they then add all of their Ubuntu stuff on top of that to then release it out as the distro, and that's where Ubuntu comes from.
So wait, so Ubuntu is based on untested software?
It sounds like that, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Because I said it comes from testing. So just to understand, Debian actually goes through a whole development cycle, and not just Debian, pretty much every software product these days. And if we pull up this right here, so this is the workflow that Debian goes through whenever they create a new version of their distro. So they always start out with a unstable or experimental branch, right? Experimental usually never goes anywhere. That's where a developer's just trying something. Oh, I wonder if this will work. And then maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. But once they figure out what they want to do, they kind of create the first version of the package or the change or whatever. And that goes into unstable. Unstable means it probably still has some bugs. It could cause some crashes, whatever. But once they've kind of worked out the kinks there, then it goes into testing. Testing is where they validate whether or not the package works for everybody else, for all the different architectures that are out there and the different types of computers and different use cases. And they verify that functionality. And only once it's passed all the tests there does it go into stable. Well, stable is an actual release of Debian. The Ubuntu team or Canonical, they don't want an actual release of Debian because it has some software that they don't use or that they replace with something else. So they pull from testing the same way that Debian does, right? Debian stable comes from their testing branch. Ubuntu's stable comes from Debian's testing branch. So don't think that's a bad thing that it comes from testing. It's just that's where the packages are fully tested and approved, and then it becomes that next distro. And Ubuntu is not the only one. There's actually a number of different operating systems that do what's called forking. They fork, like a branch on the road. They fork the Debian development model right there at that testing branch to become theirs. And you'll see other ones like, Well, even further down the line, like Linux Mint. Linux Mint is a fork of Ubuntu, which is a fork of Debian. So that, it all kind of stacks together into this weird family tree of Linux.
So, what are the minimum requirements needed to install Ubuntu?
If you want to install, let's see, I've got the minimum requirements pulled up right here. They post them on their website. Similar to other Linux distros, the requirements are actually not that high. It will run on a lot of different hardware. The big differentiating factor here is going to be whether or not you want just a command line interface or whether you want a graphical user interface as well. For a desktop, you'll want a graphical user interface. For a server, you normally don't need it. So you can just go CLI and get away with even lower hardware. The desktop edition, they recommend that you have a 2 gigahertz dual core processor or better, as well as 2 gigs of RAM and about 25 gigs of hard drive space. Now, if you watched our CentOS show on installing CentOS, the minimum requirements there were only 512 megabytes for memory for a graphical user interface. Here, they're saying 2 gigs. Why is that? Well, the reason is with CentOS, they kept it pretty easy, pretty light, right? Not the best user experience, but on Ubuntu, you get a very pretty desktop with a lot of visual effects, and it's all designed to be easy to use, which consumes more memory. So for a good experience, it's got higher requirements than many other Linux distros that are out there. That being said, if you go to the store today to buy a laptop, you'll be hard pressed to find one with less than 2 gigs of RAM. They almost all have 2 or more that are in them. Same thing with the processor. Finding, you really can't find single core processors anymore, and they're almost all 2 gigahertz or higher. So as far as current generation computers, pretty much everything meets these needs. But if you have a computer that's 5 or even 10 years old, it may still meet these needs as well. So just evaluate that and determine. But those are the desktop requirements. The server requirements are a little bit different. Notice on the server side, it drops to 256 megabytes of memory because we're getting rid of the GUI, getting rid of all the flashy elements and just going command line. That's actually lower than CentOS. With CentOS, it was 392 megabytes for a command line only install. But they also say a 300 megahertz x86 or a 32-bit processor is the minimum there. That is old, right? A 300 megahertz computer, I think the last time I had a 300 megahertz computer would have been right around 1998, maybe.
90-01.
20 years ago, right? That's a long time. So it'll run on a 20-year-old computer. That's kind of what it'll do.
Yeah.
But, it's all very flexible. And that's all kind of a part of the Ubuntu model is you pick what you need, and then they've got a deployment that'll match it.
Don, what can we do to get ready for the install?
There's a few things that we need to do to, just like anything. One, we need to make sure we learn and that we know Ubuntu is the right distro for us, that it's got everything that we want to meet our normal workflow, that the software we want is available. If I work in Photoshop every single day, and I decide I'm going to go to Linux, well, there's no version of Photoshop for Linux, so I'm going to lose that. But also, there's software that is made for Linux, but only made for certain distros. So there may be some package like GIMP is the kind of Photoshop open source variant that you can run, and it'll run on Ubuntu as well as CentOS and other ones. So you just need to evaluate, is the software you need available for that distro? Sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't. Software like Google Chrome, they release for Ubuntu or Debian-based systems, as well as Red Hat systems like CentOS. There's other platforms, though, like Steam, the video game platform. They release an Ubuntu binary, and that's it. So, if you want to run Steam, you can do it easy on Ubuntu. On any other distro, you've got to jump through hurdles to get it up and working. So we need to research that. Second thing is we need to make an installation media. And the installation media, I'm looking at the site here, but if we go back to the main website here, you can go to download the Ubuntu software. And when you look at the downloads that are available, you pick between Ubuntu desktop or server. It's your choice. And then you pick from the various versions. The version number is based on the year and the month that it was released. So this version that it's recommending to me was released in April of 2018. Okay, now that's almost a year ago from when this episode is being filmed. But this is also the LTS release, or long-term support. That means that they're going to support this one for several years. If you don't see an LTS, that means they're going to support you for 6 months, and that's it. Then you have to upgrade. They stop doing updates on it. They do a 6-month release cycle, and it's always in April and October. I say always There's things that could derail it, but so far it's always been April and October. So you'll usually see a year followed by either 04 or followed by 10. And well, right now we're in March of 2019. So the October 2018 release did come out. In fact, if I scroll down, there it is, Ubuntu 18.10. I could download it, but it wasn't the recommended one because it's not LTS. There's no long-term support on it. All right. Also, they only do long-term support every other year on even numbered years. So 16.04 was a long-term support and 14.04 was long-term support, right? But 1704 wasn't, and 1904, which is coming out next month, well, probably already out by the time you watch this, but 1904 will not be a long-term support either. So if you're going to run Ubuntu in a business, in an environment where you need to ensure that you have updates and not have to actually upgrade the distro underneath, well, you'll want to run an even numbered year that's flagged as LTS, right? That's going to be really important. If it's just your own computer, though, you can feel free to go with the cutting edge. I can install 1810. I just need to know that when 1904 comes out, they're going to stop updating 1810. Even if security fixes come out, they're going to stop updating it, and they'll expect me to upgrade to 1904 at that point. So that's kind of a big difference there. So you can download whichever one you want to run with. So let's say I download the 1804 LTS. You can download it as an ISO file, which you could then burn to a DVD and install that way, but most people don't have DVDs anymore. So instead, you're likely going to be using a USB key like the one that I've got right here. So they put instructions on the site for how to create a bootable USB stick, and it varies based on which operating system you're on. The laptop I'm on is actually running Windows right now, and so it's detected that, and it's saying, here's the instructions on how you can do that. They want you to go and download the the ISO image from the site, and then once you've downloaded it, you just kind of advance through here, and it's step-by-step telling you what to do, and they're offering to use a software package called Rufus, which is also used by most of the other distros. You can view Rufus. Their website is rufus.ie. So if you go to that website, you can download the Rufus tool. And, actually, it's sending me to a different URL, isn't it? Let me just go to rufus.ie. There we go. And that's the tool. It's a Windows-only tool, though. So let me suggest to you a different tool that works on Windows, macOS, and Linux. It's a tool called Etcher. And the Etcher utility, let me just bring it up here, is nice because it will run, if I can spell it, there it is, Balena Etcher. Let me pull up the website so you guys can see this. So the website is balena.io, balena.io, and their utility Etcher. It's a super easy utility designed to take ISOs and write them to a USB key, and it runs on Windows, macOS, and Linux. So the steps are kind of the same regardless of which platform you happen to be on. You just go and download the appropriate binary for the operating system that you're running, and then you can fire it up and go. And what Balena looks like is this, or Etcher is the actual name of the software, and it's just 3 steps. You pick what your ISO is, you pick the USB key you want to flash, and then you flash it. So I'm going to go ahead and hit Select Image, and I'll browse to my ISO folder where I've downloaded that 1804 ISO from the site.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'll just plug in my USB key into one of my available ports. There we go. And see how it detected it right there. But it's always a good idea to verify that it actually found the right media, because if you pick maybe you have a hard drive that you back up to, you could erase it and lose all your backups. That would be really bad.
That'd be a bad thing.
But I can see it's 15.6 gigs. My USB key is 16 gigs. Oh, something worth mentioning there. You're going to need a USB key that's at least 8 gigs in size. And that's because the ISO is just a little bit too big to fit on a 4 gig USB stick. So you'll need 8 gigs or larger, which are, $6 or $7 on Amazon. So it's really inexpensive to do that. My USB key is 16 gigs, so it's too big, but it'll just leave part of it empty. No big deal there. And then we can hit flash. And at that point, it's going to prompt for admin privileges. There we go. And now it's going to go and write that. If you're on a USB 2.0 port, this could take a while, right? I'm on a USB 3.0 port, so it won't take that long. But even still, it'll probably take 5 or 10 minutes as it copies all of that data to the USB key. Once we've got that, now we've got the tool that we're going to use to actually install Ubuntu. The only other thing we need to do is when we install Ubuntu, we're going to potentially erase everything off of our current computer. So like if I install right here on my laptop, it's got Windows on it. I'm going to lose that, right? Well, do I care? Probably not. But if I have data on there that's important to me, I need to make sure I back that up. So you want to back up all of your data and keep that handy. because an install will likely destroy it. Even if you do a dual boot situation where you're running Windows and Ubuntu on the same hard drive, there's always the risk that something could go wrong during the installer and you lose the data. So performing a backup is another great step to do prior to actually installing Ubuntu.
Well, Don, now that we're all ready, how do we actually do the install?
So starting the install is actually pretty easy. We need to boot off of that USB key. So USB key is already in my computer. I basically just need to restart and boot from the key. Now, how you do that is different depending on which computer you're on. On mine, I need to press F6 during the boot sequence. You might need to press F11. I know a lot of Dells do that. So you may need to look at your documentation for your BIOS to figure out what the shortcut key is to tell it, hey, I want to boot from another device. Then you can choose to boot from the USB key. And when you do, if you get it right, you're going to see this screen. Now, when you reboot your computer, you'll know you did it right. If you see that screen right there, it's a purple screen with a little keyboard and a kind of a stick man. Those are the accessibility options that are popping up there to let us know that if we are hearing impaired or vision impaired, you can click on those and there's additional tools there to help you better interact with the installer. Then we'll see the Ubuntu logo kind of flash by. And after that, it should load the graphical user interface for Ubuntu. Now, I say it should. It's trying to detect the hardware in your system, and it does a pretty good job, but it's not perfect. Like, notice on my screen, I actually have two problems that I can tell right now. One problem, I have these big black bars on the left and right side of my screen. It detected my monitor, but it didn't detect that it was 16 by 9, or a 16 by 9 ratio. It just picked it up as 4 by 3, so it's giving me some black bars. Hopefully, during the install, it will properly detect and load the right drivers for that, and if it does, then we'll see it stretch out and go 16 by 9. If it doesn't, that's something I'll have to fix myself after the install is over. Also, it's really zoomed in, which means it's probably at a pretty low resolution, probably at this size, like 640 by 480 or maybe 800 by 600. So the resolution is kind of wrong. That's easy to fix down the road too. But it's doing the best it can, and I am actually in the installer, so that's a pretty good sign. Now, Ubuntu does something really cool with their installer. They give you a choice to try before you buy, right? Not that we have to buy, it's all free, but you can try Ubuntu without actually installing it on your hard drive. You can just run it from memory. It'll copy from the USB key into RAM and run it. It's what's called a live CD, even though it's not actually a CD. That way you can run it, and if you love it, great, then you go and do the install. But if something doesn't work right, you just reboot your machine and you can boot back into your regular operating system. Nothing on your hard drive gets changed. So really cool to do that. But I want to install it. I'm ready to go ahead and commit. We're going to get that installed. So I'll click on Install Ubuntu. Now, the majority of the choices are going to already be filled in for me. It's trying to guess what I need. It's looking at my system and anticipating that I'm going to use an English US layout because that's what my keyboard is. And sure enough, I am. I could change it to something else if I had a different keyboard or I just preferred some alternate layout. You can pick those. But I'll stick with mine and hit Continue. Then it's going to ask a little bit about updates. Now, the default is it's going to do an installation right off of the disk. And when it does that, well, if your disk is really, really new, it's pretty up to date. But usually your disk or USB key is several months old, in which case there's going to be updates that are needed. And there's even updates to the installer itself. So it offers to be able to do those updates. Now, in order to do the updates, it's got to be connected to a network. I'm physically plugged in, and up here I can see that icon at the top right that says I'm on the network. If I wasn't, let's say I had a wireless card, I would need to click on that little network icon and choose the wireless network right here and type in my SSID. I'm wired though, so it automatically detected that, and that's why I have the option to download updates while installing. If that's grayed out, then you'll know that it's not connected to a network. That's kind of the indicator. We also have the option to do a minimal install, which installs literally the bare minimum packages needed to boot Ubuntu. If you do that, you do get a graphical user interface on this one. It's not like a server where a minimal install has no GUI. Here, it's a minimal install with a web browser and some basic utilities. This is nice because you don't get all the bloat, all the extra software you might not care about, but all that extra software makes it easier to use. And you'll see things like office software, games, media players. That's stuff people use. And so you kind of save the effort of having to install that by doing a normal install. The last option here is install third-party software for graphics and Wi-Fi hardware and additional media formats. Linux is a free operating system kernel, and it's released under the GPL, which is a licensing agreement that says basically any code that becomes a part of this has to be publicly available. Well, a lot of hardware manufacturers release drivers, And Intel does this with their wireless cards. NVIDIA and AMD do it with their video cards. They release drivers, and they don't want to show people the source code because that might give away their secrets to how their hardware works. So they do it as binary files, so you can't see inside of them. Well, the GPL doesn't really allow for that. And so with Ubuntu, when it installs, it's going to install without those drivers. And you can go and download those drivers from the vendors if you want later on. But otherwise, you're going to get a fully GPL compliant system when it installs. Or you can check this little box here and say, you know what, I want to go ahead and bring those in. Okay. Now, when you choose that option, if you're doing the desktop install, then that's going to be fine. You know, you go through, it'll install the software. If you're doing a server install, it can actually cause some problems with encryption on the disk. So on the server side, we don't normally do that, but on the desktop side, we can. I actually don't have any special hardware in mind, so I'm going to uncheck that. I don't need anything. But on my other laptop, I do. I have a wireless card that needs third-party drivers, and so I check that so it'll install the drivers. All right, on my next screen, it's going to ask what I want to do about my hard drive. Now, Ubuntu will detect if you already have an operating system on there and offer to dual boot, so you have that choice. Or we can erase the entire disk and use the whole thing for Ubuntu. If you do that, it's going to lay out our partition scheme just automatically, and we don't have to worry about it. We can choose to encrypt the install if we want right from here. And let me tell you, encrypting from here, it's easy. You check a box, right? If you decide to encrypt later on down the road, it's really hard. It's hard once you already have data on the disk. Right now, there's no data, so it's super easy to encrypt. So if you want to do it, now's the time to make that choice and save yourself a lot of trouble. We also have the option to use the Logical Volume Manager, or LVM. So LVM lets us dynamically resize partitions, and you can take two hard drives and glue them together to create one larger hard drive. Kind of neat stuff like that. On a desktop and a laptop, it is rarely useful. You usually only have one hard drive, and the hard drive's not changing sizes. It's a fixed size. So we don't really need it, and Ubuntu turns that off by default. You can turn it on if you want, though, in servers, especially file servers, where it really comes in handy. But in this case, I don't really need it, so I'll leave it off. You could choose something else, which says, I want to set up the hard drive myself. If you have a particular hard drive layout you want to do, you can choose something else. And when you hit continue, now it's going to show you your disk, and you can come through and create all the partitions that you need. So, you know, at a minimum, you need two partitions. You need a swap partition for your swap file. When you run out of memory, you'll start using disk for memory. And you need a root partition for storing everything else. So I could come in and say, all right, I'm going to pick my disk. I just have that one hard drive. I can hit the plus sign to add in a new disk. And, oh, actually, I need to create a partition table first. So on the right here, I've got a button that says New Partition Table. So I'll hit that and hit Continue. So now I've got that free space ready to be used, and I can hit the plus sign here. And first off, I'm going to create that swap partition. So it's going to ask for a size. I'm just going to do, I'll do 2 gigs. So 2048 megabytes. And for the file system, I'm going to tell it that it is the swap area. So I'll create that. We usually create it at the beginning of the disk. On a spinning disk, this actually gets you a bit of a performance improvement. On an SSD like I've got, though, it makes no difference. So if the swap is first or last, doesn't really matter. And then I've got all this other space. I could come in and just say, make all of that my root and just be done with it. You know, just take whatever size is left, come in, and I'll make that a primary partition. I'll do ext4 for the file system. You'll see XFS and other options if you want to use them, like BTRFS is popular for some people. I'm not a big fan. I'll stick with ext4, and I'll throw that into the root folder. All right. Now, I'm going to just lower this down to 250 gigs real quick to create that. At this point, I've got enough to do the install, right? I've got my swap partition and my root. But there's several other partitions that you may want to create. And in fact, if I had done the automatic layout, I would end up with them. Partitions like a boot partition. The /boot folder, just choose that free space. I'm going to create one. I'll make it 1 gig in size. And let's see, we'll go logical. I'm going to mount this in /boot. Or if you hit the little drop-down box, you'll see popular directories and see how /boot is right there for me. I can choose that. And now the Linux kernel will go in this folder to be stored. And that way it can be booted up read-only, and we don't have to worry about the kernel getting messed up while we're up and running. So we have that choice. And you could come through and add any of these other ones, mounting them however you want, slicing up your disk or adding other hard drives. You can have maybe the home folders on a completely different hard drive and set that up. You know, just go to your heart's content. All right here. and certainly easier to do now than later. Hard to move disks around when they already have data on them. All right, in my case, so I'm going to hit the back button, and I'm just going to choose to erase the disk, and I'm going to let Ubuntu lay out my partitions for me. So it'll create everything that we need, and we can hit install now. And once we do that, it's going to warn me one time, hey, I'm about to erase your hard drive. I'll hit continue, and now it's going to go erase the hard drive and start the installation of Ubuntu. Now, it's actually doing things in the background right now, but to keep us from being bored, it's asking some housekeeping questions like, what time zone am I in? And I'm in the Eastern time zone, but you'd click on whichever one was appropriate for you. And then setting up a user account, right? We need to have a user account on here with a password that's not a default password. So I'm going to create one for myself. I'll just tell it that I am Don Pizzette, and I'll just call this DP Ubuntu. And I'll pick a username and whatever I want to use for a password. Apparently, I picked one that's not terribly strong. You can set your system to log in automatically. Not the greatest idea for security practices. Anybody turns your computer on, it would log right in. I'm going to choose to require a password and hit continue. And at that point, notice how it says almost finished copying files. It was copying files in the background that whole time, just while I was doing those minor tasks, which were tasks I had to do anyway. But at this point, it's going to finish copying files to the hard drive. Still hasn't detected my video card, right? But some of the files that it's copying are additional drivers that weren't present a moment ago. And when it reboots, all those drivers will load, and hopefully that card will get detected. If not, that's going to be something that I have to fix.
So, Don, what are some of the first things we should do in Ubuntu?
Well, the short answer is, well, we'll have to see, right? So hopefully this thing boots up and everything is golden. It detects all my hardware and I'm in good shape, in which case the only thing I really need to do is immediately do system updates. I need to update the software so that I've got any security fixes and performance patches that have been released since this USB key was made, right? But if it boots up and hardware isn't detected, like my video card, if it's not detected, I'm going to have to solve that. I've got to go and look for the proper driver or see if I can tweak those settings to get it so that all of my hardware is working. Those are the two major things that I need to get going. In fact, looking at my install now, it looks like it's finished the install, and I just need to hit restart now. It's going to reboot, and that'll be the real moment of truth, right? So right now, it's running a very limited set of drivers to try and be compatible with the most systems that are out there. When it reloads, it's going to load the full set of drivers. So this will be that kind of moment of truth, right? We find out, is it going to detect all of our hardware? And I'm not too terribly worried about it just yet here on the login screen. But once I get past this, that'll be the point where I actually do have to worry at least a little. All right, so I'm going to get logged in here. And once it logs in, we're going to see if everything detects. I'll have to fix any missing drivers if anything's missing, and then we'll do our system updates. In fact, I can do the system updates first if I want, and that might not be a bad idea because there might be drivers that are right there available via an update that'll fix my problem. And I see it did not properly detect my video card, so I still have my black bars on the side. Although, that may just be a matter of changing the resolution, so we can double check that as well. I do get the welcome screen for Ubuntu is up here, so we can just kind of move through that. It's offering to enable Live Patch. Live Patch is really cool. Normally, there's a lot of updates that require you to reboot to apply, and those are the ones that end users are most likely to skip out on because they don't want to reboot. But with Live Patch, they can actually download and apply a lot of these updates just without rebooting right in the middle of the day. So you can turn that on. I'm going to leave that off for right now. We'll talk about it later on. And whoops, and then I'm going to click next a bunch of times because I was getting click happy there. But I'm going to get back to my desktop. So I'm going to go ahead and perform the updates. Now, there's a few different ways we can do the updates. There's actually a software utility that'll do the updates for us. You can kind of see the little Ubuntu software application here, and it has the ability to do updates. It's actually telling me that I'm up to date. But I can also use the terminal. If I just right-click on the desktop and go to Open Terminal, I can jump right here and do it right from the command line. It's a simple utility. We can do sudo to get our administrative privileges, and then apt update. And that command is going to tell it to reach out to the Ubuntu servers and find out if there's updates, right? So it's downloading a list of updates. It's not actually downloading the updates yet. It's just getting a list to find out if we need anything. And here it's telling me there's 70 packages that need to be updated. So then I can run sudo apt upgrade, and it's actually going to do the upgrade. And I'll say yes to that. And now it's downloading the 70 packages and patching all that. You guys saw me, I downloaded the installer right from the website. I put it onto the USB key and did the install. This is all within the span of maybe 2 hours. Well, it's got 70 updates. That's because the image that I downloaded was from April of last year. There's a lot of things that change between now and then. So that's why we have so many. That's why it's so important to do these updates. Now, when it's done, I'll likely have to reboot, hopefully, and I didn't actually pay a whole lot of attention in here, but hopefully one of those was my video card driver. If not, I'll have to go and get that from the vendor. Also, I might even, oh, it's actually offering to do the GUI update now, which I've already done the command line one, so I can ignore that one. There might actually be some other options in here if I go and jump into my settings. If I hit the power button at the top right and go into settings, and then go into my devices, I can find my display. And here's my resolution. I can see it's set at 800 by 600, which is a pretty weak resolution. Oh, and there's all the other ones right here. So I can go through and find, let's go into something a little more friendly. And, oh, you know what? I can't, I can't see the apply button because it was off the screen. So let me get back in here and set that again. There we go. And now, look at that. Perfect. All right. So I get, oh, actually, it's not quite right. I got a little, still little black bars there. So I might have to tweak it a little bit, again, to get that set up. These are all steps that we have to go through with a new system when we first get it configured and get that kind of put in place. So once that's all done, though, once you've got that set, everything configured the way you want it, now you're good to start installing additional software, configuring items, making sure your hard drive is configured properly and that your disk shows up, and all the other things. We want to verify that stuff now, because if something's wrong right now, I don't have anything on this system. I can format and reinstall. I don't lose anything. But if I use this for a month, for 2 months, and start loading all my personal data on there, and then I spot, oh, these hard drives are partitioned wrong, I can't just format anymore because I've got data on there. I've got to back up all my data and realign. That's a big challenge. So spend a few minutes after the install just looking around the system, making sure that everything's working properly. And when it does, then you know you're in good shape, and now you can start using the system.
Awesome. Thank you, Don. Installing Ubuntu, another great episode. Hey, before we move on, anything else you'd like to say?
The steps that we went through right here were for Ubuntu. It's actually very similar for Debian and a number of other operating systems that are all based on the Ubuntu line. But there are also alternative Ubuntu installations. I did the default one here from the Canonical website, which uses GNOME as the graphical user interface. There's actually Kubuntu, Lubuntu, and there's another one. Well, anyhow, if you want XFCE as your user interface, or if you want LXDE, if you want Cinnamon or Mate, all those different user interfaces, there's different distros available from the Ubuntu site. They have these like links to additional parties that support those. You're welcome to choose those. They're not officially part of the Canonical support system, but they are at least approved or blessed or whatever, allowed by Canonical for other people to create them. So if you want full support, you'll stick with the default, which does default to GNOME. And all of those other graphical user interfaces are actually in the repositories. You can install those in addition to the GNOME interface that's already in there. So that's all up to personal preference, and you can always deal with that after the install.
Thank you, Don. CompTIA Linux Plus is a great series. Make sure you pay attention to every single episode. You're going to be glad you did when that exam comes rolling around, and rolling around it will. And don't be afraid to check out the supplementary information in the course library. It's there to help you be more successful, so check that out too. And tell everybody you know about IT Pro TV. IT Pro TV is binge-worthy. Thanks for watching. I'm Zach Memis.
And I'm Don Pizzette.
We will see you again soon.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.